Good morning. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word. I'm Barry Bryson, and today we're continuing our study of neglected books of the New Testament by beginning a study of the Book of Philemon. Philemon, which follows Titus, the book we just studied in the New Testament. Philemon is a very short book. In fact, it's not a book at all. It's a letter. It's a personal letter. Or is it? Between the Apostle Paul and a very old friend of his, someone he cares very deeply about, named Philemon. And the subject of this letter is a man named Onesimus. Onesimus has been Philemon's slave, and as becomes evident in the reading of the letter, Onesimus, before he ran away, caused some sort of injury, not necessarily personal or physical injury, but economic injury to Philemon. Through the providence of God, Onesimus and Paul come into contact in prison in Rome, where the Apostle Paul converts Onesimus and he becomes a Christian. So in this letter, the Apostle Paul is sending Onesimus back to Philemon, and he has a request. He wants Onesimus to set Philemon free and to send him back to Paul in Rome, where Onesimus can serve alongside of Paul and facilitate his ministry while Paul is in prison. Now, what becomes obvious and evident as we read the book is that although Philemon and Paul know each other from way back, and Paul has a great deal of affection for, care for Philemon, he expects that this is not going to be an easy sell, that Philemon is not going to want to free Onesimus, that he's going to want some sort of retribution against Onesimus, and that he certainly will not agree to send Onesimus back to Rome. And so the book of Philemon is, in a very real sense, a textbook about the art of persuasion. We talked about 1 Peter being used quite literally in the early church as a textbook for surviving waves of persecution, especially state-sponsored persecution. And 2 Peter being a textbook about how to address false teaching from within. Philemon really is a textbook on persuading. Persuading someone to do the right thing when you know they don't really want to do the right thing and you are powerless to force them to. The Apostle Paul is in jail. He can't be there to make the appeal himself. He can't be there to arrange things. He has to be able to persuade Philemon through the written word, and he brings to bear so many different tools of persuasion in this letter. I read a book back in the early 80s. It was published in 1981 called Getting to Yes, and it was by Fisher and Urey, and they had been negotiators in the Carter administration who helped produce the Camp David Accords. And the book was quite literally about getting people to do the right thing when they don't want to do the right thing by using above board and persuasive means. Well, it was a wonderful book, but not as good at that as this book is. Paul, with all of his education, not only his rabbinic education and his classical education and his rhetorical education, but just knowing people, being on the mission field, establishing relationships, he brings everything in his tool belt to bear. You get a real sense of what is at stake in Paul's mind and in Paul's heart as he writes this letter, and the obstacle that he's up against. There's a tight connection between this letter and the book of Colossians, which we're going to really talk more about at the end of our study. But it seems that both Colossians and Philemon were delivered at the same time to the same congregation and people in that congregation by the same people. Anyway, we'll talk more about that. In our few remaining moments, we want to remind ourselves, and I've done this several times in our 5 good minutes about the institution of slavery in Rome, which was not in any way the institution of slavery in the American South. In Rome, slaves were, by law, human beings, and had rights in themselves as human beings. They weren't 3/5 of a person or a percentage of a person. They were a person. If you were a slave and you were married, your wife was not necessarily a slave unless she herself sold herself into slavery. If you and your wife were both slaves and you bore children, those children were born free. They did not belong to your master. Slaves were protected by law, and increasingly so as the Roman Empire continued. In fact, most people released their slaves by their mid to late 30s. The reason being that at that time, with life expectancy being somewhere in the mid 40s to 50 years old, someone's profitable years were getting beyond them, and owners did not want to be responsible for the upkeep of people who were not going to be able to produce. The thing about slavery in the Roman Empire is it was the only true social safety net available. So if a man has a large family, he could sell himself as a slave and receive room, board, and upkeep, also get the money for himself and use that to help his family, and his family stayed free. It really was the only social safety net available to people during the Roman Empire. And so we should not expect the Apostle Paul to be Horace Greeley or Frederick Douglass, because they were not dealing with the same institution. However, the Apostle Paul fully expects this slave to be set free. We'll talk more about this tomorrow. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word.